feedback on this. Maybe that's hello. All right. So are there any questions on the material? I'm going to keep working with you guys to change the attitude about interacting with the professor in lectures. It's totally okay to ask questions, raise your hands, stop me, ask for clarifications. And the old trope that if you're confused about something, it's likely that at least 20%, if not all of the class is confused about the same thing. So there's no reason for you not to raise your hand and ask for clarification or whatever. So please, and if I ask you stuff, I want you to try to answer it. Okay, so last time we discussed the problem of medical harm, and we identified different sorts of bad things that can happen to patients. And we noted that iatrogenesis is the leading killer in the United States, in the top 10 leading causes of death. We talked about various ways of responding to this problem, focusing both on the patient and the physician agency of those individuals, and also on the structure. That is to say, what happens to the patient depends not only on their own choices and actions, but also on the structural constraints and opportunities that the healthcare system presents them with. And we reviewed various structural adjustments that could reduce harm and error in that situation. And finally, we talked about Illich's concept of social iatrogenesis, which is a very interesting and profound idea that Illich advanced. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about how religion and beliefs can affect health and survival. And we're going to begin to introduce a new set of ideas about how human behaviors, how individual choices about their behaviors, and about how structural factors that affect people's behaviors affects their health outcomes in diverse ways. And when we come back next week, we'll begin to march through a variety of behaviors: eating behaviors, smoking behaviors, exercising behaviors, drinking behaviors. To some extent, we'll look a little at sexual behaviors, a variety of behaviors that play a role in public health. But today we're going to talk about religion, which primarily affects health via its impact on behaviors. So religion, and distinctly religious organizations, often fulfill diverse functions in our lives and in our societies. They provide for the needy, they keep people connected, they fulfill symbolically important functions, they preserve wisdom and norms across generations, and so on. And sometimes these may even, seem at odds with each other. This is I don't know how truthful this is, whether it's made up or not, but, here's your parish hall, we got Alcoholics Anonymous on Monday, abuse spouses on Tuesday, eating disorders on Wednesday, say no to drugs, teen suicide watch, the soup kitchen, and the Sunday sermon, America's Joyous Future, which is sort of a contrast between different functions that religious institutions might play in our society. On the one hand, kind of bolstering a kind of commonality and unity in the social group, kind of optimism, even of joy, sometimes ideally even a kind of transcendence, but also simultaneously concerning themselves with the inevitable problems in the world of poverty, of substance use, of violence, and so forth, all illustrated here. And we've already seen some evidence of the importance of religion to people's lives and to medical care. One survey of seriously ill patients that was in your readings a couple of weeks ago now, or whatever it was, identified numerous attributes of a good death. And several of those were religiously tinged and were very commonly of concern. So for example, being at peace with God, 89% of Americans say that's very important. You may or may not know this, but America is one of the most religious societies on earth. It's kind of odd, actually, given our own political history. Although secularism is rising the world over. Incidentally, as a sidebar, one of the reasons there have been so many so-called secular ideologies that are arising, people obsessed with UFOs, or people obsessed with a kind of climate change, or people of political polarization, commitment to social justice, a lot of these non-religious, ostensibly secular issues, there's a rising commitment, and many people have been arguing that those are replacing the ideological void being left as religion declines, commitment to religion declines in our society. But nevertheless, we're still extremely religious, and you can see 89% of Americans being at peace with God is an important part of a good death. 85% say that prayer is very important. Well, when we speak about religion, what do we mean exactly? And it's very important to disarticulate three distinct ideas when we think about how religion, when we think of religion in general, let alone when we think about how religion might affect health. The first is what's known as affiliation. That's what religious denomination are you? You know, are you a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu, Hindu, or, you know, what are you? Or within those religions, you know, what are you, a Shiite or Shiite? Are you an Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative? Are you a Baptist or a Protestant or a Catholic or an Orthodox, etc.? That's affiliation. The second idea is one of observance or participation. This is to what extent, regardless of what religion you are, do you observe the rules of that religion? And or do you participate in the practices of that religion? Do you go to church? Do you show up? Do you not eat pork? Do you pray 5 times a day? You know, what are you doing that's obeying the rules, the fundamental rules of that religion? And the third, and the most interesting to me, and actually I think the one that's probably biologically or evolutionarily the most fundamental, and we'll come back to that, is this notion of religiosity or spirituality. This is the notion that regardless of what religion you have, regardless of whether you participate in the religion or not, how spiritual are you? How transcendent? Do you believe in the existence of things unseen, right? Can you have a kind of sense of transcendence? Incidentally, you don't need to be religious to have this, right? You can be completely secular and still like be powerfully moved by great vistas. I can't remember, have I talked to you about the origins of awe? I think I did mention that in this class. No? Awe? No, maybe not. So, raise your hands if you've ever had that tingling feeling in your spine when you look out at a desert or a forest or a Grand Canyon. You ever had that feeling? It's like a great feeling, isn't it? A kind of just, wow, you feel a sense of peace, you kind of feel it. Why do we have that feeling? Jane Goodall has observed chimpanzees that seem to have the same kind of feeling. She's seen chimps climb up to trees and look at sunsets and sit there very still and look at this vista, right? So there's a set of arguments about why we evolved to have this feeling. One of those arguments has to do with that we have that feeling at times when we need to get outside of ourselves and connect with others. That feeling of awe, of disembodiment, of transcendence, of, oh my God, I'm nothing in the face of the universe or in the face of creation. That feeling is especially useful and powerful if you have to work together to confront the danger. So one of the arguments, this is an argument, the data for this is hard to muster, is that when you are about to, you reach an ice sheet, and you have to cross this ice sheet, or you see a very powerful force of nature, like a hurricane or a volcano, you're more likely to survive if you suspend your own individual concerns, and you kind of are able to bond with others. So one theory as to the origins of the feeling of awe has to do with this notion that you connect to other people. Anyway, this is connected in turn to this notion of religiosity or transcendence or spirituality. Now, if you had to pick, which of these do you think would be the most heritable in the sense of being partially genetically encoded? Which of these would have the strongest foundation in our genes? Affiliation, participation, or observance, or religiosity? Which one do you think natural selection might have equipped us to? Yeah, Ben.
Probably spirituality.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of feeling that there would be much more likely at play, as I just alluded to, an evolutionary role, and differences across people might be much more attributable to genetic factors than, let's say, cultural factors. Although both play a role. Second most, do you think? Do you think there are genes for being Christian or Hindu? No, you do not think your affiliation relates to your genetic background, right? You think that's culturally imposed. That's arbitrary. I can take you and convert you from one religion to another. It just depends as a chance where you happen to be born. Okay? So we don't think that's the case. We do think there's some role of genetics and evolution in religiosity and spirituality, and then the second one is the one in the middle. Okay? Some of us, maybe much more, in fact, many of you that got here to Yale, you got to Yale because you were good at obeying rules, right? At some point in high school, you even before high school, you were disciplined, you had grit, you had tenacity, you were able to perform well and study hard, you were able to delay gratification, right? All of you, on average, have substantially higher skills in all of those personality traits than anyone else, let alone your intelligence, which is substantially higher than the average Americans. So this ability to, this desire to obey rules varies across people in ways that have been shown to be partially genetic. I see a lot of nodding going on, but I can assure you, you're all very anal, so just trust me on this. If you say, oh no, I'm chill. No, you're not chill. Okay, you're just not. You think you are. Maybe for Yale you're chill, but for the world in general, you're just not chill. So let's look more closely at the possible role of religion in health. And in general, religious people are healthier and live longer. Period. And various aspects of religion can affect health behavior, can affect social interactions, can affect people's psychology, and can affect decision-making and people's ethical stances. So what position you take with respect to certain fundamental topics of the day. I mean, abortion comes often to mind, but that's actually not a distraction. It's the one most frequently thought of, but that's not the key one. Or again, that's not the key one. But for example, notions of stewardship of the earth. Believe it or not, your position on climate change could be affected by your religion, for example. And the effect sizes for all of these is very high. Being unreligious can be worse for your life expectancy, for example, than being a smoker. Okay? So it makes a big difference whether you're religious or not. And there's also even some evidence for a dose-response relationship. The more religious you are, the healthier you are, in general, across a variety of studies. But it's important to note that the effects of religion can be both positive and negative, depending on the religion or on the practices. Not all religious customs are ipso facto salubrious. Some religious customs are really deadly. They're not a good idea, but nevertheless, they're religious customs. And sorting out causation is really hard because there are no experiments or even quasi-experiments that I'm aware of involving a random assignment of religious exposures. Okay? Certainly you can do adoption studies, but those are not so informative. If you take, kids from one religion, adopted and raised into another religion, that's not really where the action is. What we would really like is some experiment where we randomly assign you to go to church a lot and you not to go to church a lot. Or randomly somehow assign you to be really spiritual and you not to be spiritual. It's kind of hard to imagine how we would do such an experiment or even find a proxy for it. In other words, we imagine that religion works causally by the following kind of mechanistic paths. So we say, remember we've been talking about this in class, here's some aspect of religion, affiliation, participation, religiosity. Maybe it changes your health behaviors, whether you smoke or not, or whether you have premarital sex or do something else, and then that affects your health. Or it affects your social connections. You're very religious, so you go to church and you meet a lot of people there, and they support you. Okay? That would be good for you, maybe. So it affects your health. Or it gives you some kind of psychological advantage. It makes you more calm in the face of adversity, so your blood pressure gets lowered. And so that's how it affects your health. And in fact, the psychological thing on the end there, it can include both attitudinal shifts, like how you cope with or see, for example, the world around you, and also stress. Your ability to cope with stress, your stress coping techniques. And for example, something known as precessory prayer. Precessory prayer is when you pray for yourself. Intercessory prayer is when you pray for other people. Precessory prayer can be very valuable via a variety of mechanisms, a kind of meditative practice, or a kind of deliberate kind of cultivation in you and a kind of transcendence, where you sort of get out of your own problems for a while, think about the problems of others. It can kind of calm you down and minimize the wear and tear on your own body when you begin to think more deeply and fundamentally about other human beings. But the direction of the arrow could also be the opposite, as in all the other things we've been considering in the last few lectures. For example, you might go to church more if you are healthy or wealthy. Maybe sick people can't get to church, so they stay home. So when we observe that churchgoers are healthier, it's not because church is making them healthy, it's because their healthiness is making them churchgoers. And same with wealth, for example. Or maybe it could be the opposite. Perhaps people go to church more when they are sick or poor, right? So maybe it's not that direction. Maybe it's the same direction from health to religion, but instead of increasing your observance, it decreases your observance. So the causation can be an up or down direction and back and forth at the same time. So it can be quite a mixed picture what the relationship between religion and health might be. That is, as with the other things we've been considering in this course, there are problems in studying religion. Religion and health may be what is known as endogenous, kind of co-determined, for numerous reasons. For example, there could be parental factors related to your early childhood that predispose you both to being religious and to having better health. Maybe certain kinds of parents, are more likely to cause you to have one of those qualities of religion, affiliation, participation, and religiosity, and those same kinds of parents might also inculcate in you or take better care of you and have better health practices. So we come along and we study the effect of religion and health, and we think, oh, this is causing that, but actually no, there's some third factor confounding, namely parental attributes that are causing both. So we wrongly are concluding that religion and health are related, whereas they're not, except via this backdoor path that's highlighted here. Or social connections might not be on the causal path, but instead simply confound the relationship, causing both a taste for religious practice and for better health. So maybe people who are friendly are more likely to be religious and to seek out religious experiences or groups that are practicing. Maybe people that are friendly or have many connections may also have more health. And once again, going back to the issue, well then what happens when we control for social connection, when we're assessing the impact of religion on health? It depends on our causal model. If we think that the way religion, and remember 3 slides ago I said, well maybe the way religion affects health is that religion modifies your social connections modify your health. That was on the bottom here. Maybe that's not the right thing to do then, to control for social connection, because that's how religion is affecting health. Whereas here, maybe we do want to do that, because after taking into account social connection, do we still have a relationship between religion and health in this regard? Or to the extent that religion is genetically based, there might be a common genetic basis for aspects of religion and health. So there's lots going on here. It's very difficult to disarticulate it to know what is the causal relationship between religion and health. Nevertheless, there's good evidence for the genetic basis for religion. So here's one study. This is something known as a twin study. In a twin study, what you do is you take a pair of same-sex dizygotic siblings, fraternal twins. Okay, so we genetically share 50% of our genes, me with my male fraternal twin. Over here, you get a whole bunch of them. You get like 100 pairs of same-sex dizygotic twins. And over here, you get 100 pairs of monozygotic twins. They have to be same-sex. They're genetically identical. And then in each of these couplets, you measure how religious they are. How religious I am, how religious my co-twin is. And then across all 100 of them, you quantify, I'll explain the slide in a minute, you can just listen to me now. So you quantify across all 100 of these pairs, how correlated is my religion, my religiosity to my co-twin's religiosity. So you estimate how knowledge of my religiosity enhances your ability to predict my co-twin's religiosity on average across all 100 couplets. And then you repeat the same exercise over here with this other 100 couplets. And if you find that over here, knowledge of one twin's religiosity makes you better able to predict the other twin's religiosity than you are able to do over here. Here, it doesn't matter. If you know one twin's religiosity, you don't know the other twin's religiosity. If you were to find that extreme, you would conclude that actually religion is genetic, okay? That it's highly heritable. That the explanation is because these two guys are really correlated, they share 100% of their genes. These two guys are not really correlated, and they only share 50% of their genes. And just to restate all that, what you're measuring there is something known as heritability. And heritability is the proportion of phenotype variation in a population that's attributable to genetic variation among individuals. So to what extent, for example, is height heritable? So 50% of height is heritable. Most of your height is determined by your genes, let's say, and a little bit by your nutrition and environment and other stuff. So that's what we mean by heritability. In twin studies, you can take dizygotic fraternal twins and monozygotic identical twins who are reared together or reared apart. That's another wrinkle in twin studies. And when you do that, you find that a religious sensibility, this notion of religiosity, is heritable in the 0.35 to 0.55 range. Perhaps as much as half of how religious you are, how the extent to which you feel a sense of transcendence can be explained by your genes. And it depends also on the particular phenotype. Are we talking about the frequency of attendance of religious services? Are we talking about religiosity? but not are we talking about specific religion. There's no evidence for a genetics of a specific religion. And this is roughly equal to the heritability of other phenotypes like major depression, alcoholism, extreme right-wing ideology, but the heritability is less than IQ. IQ is more heritable than religion. Is this clear so far? I'm getting some quizzical looks. You don't really need to understand the details of how a twin study works, although I'm happy to explain that if you want. But the gist is, by comparing genetically, it's like a natural experiment. I'm randomly assigning you guys to have the same genes, and you guys have 50% of the same genes. And if when I randomly assign you guys to have the same genes, I always find that you go to church the same frequency. And here with these two guys, I rarely find that they go to church the same frequency. That kind of thought experiment leads me to believe there's something about the genes that have to do with whether you go to church. Okay? And you can do that in a systematic, mathematical way and back out conclusions like this. Now, sometimes such findings can seem extremely implausible. For example, evidence suggests that believing in the literal truth of the Bible is partially heritable. So if you do a study and you ask people, do you believe that the earth was made 7,000 years ago? Do you believe that all of these things happened as described exactly like this? And monozygotic twins are much more likely to share that belief than dizygotic twins. Now, do we actually think they're genes for believing in the literal truth of the Bible? No. What might explain that? Anyone have any ideas? What could your genes have to do with whether you are more likely to believe that the Bible is literally true? Yes? Is that Caleb? Yes, really good. That's right. So some of you guys are really obedient and you listen to authority, and others of you less so. You're more, you question authority. Okay? So there's variation in human beings in this trait. Our general tendency to believe in authority is actually quite useful for us because we're born immature and unable to survive in the world. Those of our ancestors who listened to our parents survived. Those of our ancestors who did not listen to our parents died. Right? You're a baby. You better damn well listen to your mom and dad when you're 4 years old, or you'll be eaten. Okay? So there's something about obedience that has to do with how evolution has shaped us. And that could be applied to religion. So for example, I'm the kind of person, let's say, who just believes in authority and trusts authority, so that includes the Bible. So we think there might be other phenotypes that underlie this type of more superficial trait, something like that. And we're going to return to behavior genetics later in the course, like the 21st or 22nd lecture. We'll come back to this topic. Okay, well, let's review some of the mechanisms by which religion might affect health. And as you all know, many religions have rules that provide for very specific behaviors that can be salubrious or health affirming. They typically are no smoking, no drinking, no bad food, however that's defined, no bad sex, however that's defined. And this is pretty straightforward. There are rules in the religion that say you are not supposed to do these things, and this might benefit your health. And prayer, like mindfulness, so this is sort of physical, this is how religion can affect health behavior, but religion can also affect your kind of psychological state. And prayer, like mindfulness more generally, can have a variety of beneficial psychological and physiological effects. For example, one study examined a probability-based sample of 3,851 community-dwelling adults in North Carolina, and they were assembled in 1986 and followed for an average of 6.3 years. And it found that those people who reported rarely or never praying or meditating had a higher risk of death over follow-up, but that this risk went away after adjusting for the demographics of those individuals and their baseline health. So after you took into account who they were and what their baseline health was, there wasn't a relationship. But among those that were impaired baseline, that is, who were not well, the adjusted risk of not praying on survival was a 1.1. That is to say, not praying increased your risk of death by about 11%. 1.11 was the odds ratio, 11% increase in odds. And among those who were not impaired at baseline, the adjusted risk of not praying on survival was 1.63. So an even higher risk of death of not praying if you were well at baseline. So prayer seems to help the well more than the sick. And the controls here included health practices like What were they doing? Were you a smoker or drinking? So they're trying to net out the pure effect of religion after accounting for different behaviors, like smoking, for example. Also controlled for social support and for other religious practices. Now, what else do you think might cause this result? So let's say you go out into the world and you find that, that people who pray live longer. What's your name?
Ben.
Ben, yeah. Yeah. Maybe they're getting their kicks from prayer, right? So instead of using drugs to get that peaceful feeling, you know, they're going to church. And that's great. You know, that's exactly right. It's one possibility. So now you think that what's happening is it's the religion, but actually something else is going on that could be causing this effect. And not only might prayer as a devotional act affect your survival, but so perhaps might religious attendance. So it's not only your behaviors, it's not only whether you pray, it's also now your participation in the religion. This slide shows U.S. life expectancy at age 20 by the extent to which you engage in different kinds of religious attendance for 21,000 people, looking separately at blacks and whites. And they looked at frequency of attendance and average age of death. And you can see that, for example, starting first with whites, that if you never attended, you started at age 20, you lived to be about 75. If you attended, about once a week, you lived to be, whatever that is, 78. And if you attended more than once a week, you lived to be 78 or 79. And for blacks, the gradient was even steeper. Religious attendance in this study would seem to have more benefits for blacks than whites. Of course, the blacks live less long than the whites for all the reasons we've studied before. Nevertheless, religion has a very steep gradient here in its association with survival in this population. And indeed, going to religious services regularly, that is once a week or more, is associated with a significant reduction in your risk of death. And the important question is if that's actually a causal effect, if that's really what's happening, and it's not some of the other ideas I described earlier, that your parents' traits make you more observant and make you live longer. If it's actually going to church makes you live longer. The interesting question is, what's the mechanism? And here's some results based on the so-called Alameda County cohort of 5,286 people who were followed for 28 years, taken from your readings. Attenders went to services at least once a week, and they made up about 25% of the sample at baseline. So here the idea is something about religious attendance, religion specifically attendance, that changes your health behaviors, and it's those changes in health behaviors that improves your health. So then we're going to estimate different kinds of statistical models that try to estimate the pure impact of religious attendance on health. First, we're going to make sure it's not simply due to your age, gender, race or ethnicity, or your education, or what religion you're a part of. We're not trying to estimate whether Jews live longer than Catholics. We're trying to estimate whether, if you go often to services, does that make you live longer or not. And there we find that the relative hazard of death among frequent attenders is reduced by 36%. That is to say, you're 36% less likely to die over any given time horizon if you are a frequent attender. Well, what happens if we add health conditions? Now let's take into account the possibility that maybe you've got diabetes, and that put the fear of God in you, and now you start going to church. Or maybe you were hit by a car, and you had some injuries into your body, and that's why you start going to church. So maybe there is the sick people are going to church, for example. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe only the well people can get out of their house and go to church, and that's what's making them healthier. For both of those, you might want to account for the baseline health of the people, but doing that doesn't change the estimate very much. You're still 33%, 1 minus 0.67, 33% less likely to die over any specified time period. Your hazard of death is lower if you are an observer, if you go to religion services more than once a week after controlling for these things. Well, let's then also add social connections. Is it the fact that you have more friends if you go to church or temple or whatever, and there's still not much of a difference? And then let's see what happens when you add your health practices and your BMI. And when you add that, now you get a big effect. Okay? So after big change in the number, so once you take into account how fat you are and what your health practices are, now your risk of death from church attendance goes down to 0.23 23% reduction in your odds. But the point is that this number takes a big step up from this number. That means after accounting for your health behaviors, the impact of religion is not as much as it was before. And that suggests that this is the causal path, that the way religion is working on health is precisely by modifying your behaviors. And you know that because the number has gone up from these baseline rates after controlling for all these things to this number over there. Is that clear? So attenders had lower mortality than non-attenders by a substantial amount, and the effect is reduced. The coefficient moves towards 1 when controls are added, but especially when health behaviors are taken into account, suggesting that these may be the pathways, in fact, by which religion lowers mortality. And religious attendance indeed has these specific associations with particular behaviors and circumstances. So now let's focus not on the whole path. Let's just look at this first step. And what we find is that religion substantially increases your odds of stopping smoking, stopping drinking, exercising more, or losing weight. And it improves your social connections. Being religious and attending makes you more likely to stay married, makes you more likely to be involved in non-church groups, and makes you more likely to maintain contact with your friends and relatives. These results are also taken from your readings. So something about participating in a religious community can have all of these salubrious effects, affect all of these things, which then have the downstream benefits on your health. And religion can provide both real and imagined connections. And these connections may be either via prayer or via attendance. So one idea is that you can imagine here's a deity, shown in a kind of green line and a couple of people. And when you share a religion, you can imagine, oh my God, we're both participating in religion, we're both connected in this way. Or you could feel a connection to the deity. Or the connection, these two people having a connection to the deity, may prompt them to develop a real connection with each other. So for example, you and I might share the same religion, and maybe I feel a kinship to you because we have the same religion, despite other differences between us. Or maybe we both go to the same church and we meet there. It's literally a religion is facilitating an introduction. So now I can have more connections than I otherwise would. So the connections that one feels can either be imaginary connections. I can feel a kinship to my co-religionists. That is to say, I feel like, oh, other Catholics are my friends, or other Jews are my friends, or other, whatever, Hindus are my friends. Or you can actually feel a connection to the deity, or you can have real connections to the other people, or even, one can imagine, to the deity. And here's one college student's drawing of her social network when she was asked to identify the people who were close to her and significant. So this is work that was done by Catalin Mamali. He asked college students to draw their own social networks of the people they were close to. And this college student drew God as a node on their network. Here's themselves, and then here's sister number 1, mom, dad, sister number 2, who are drawn opposite to each other. Grandma, grandpa, and a friend. Sister 1 knew the friend, sister 2 knew the friend, sister 2 knew both grandma and grandpa. So she drew all the various connections, but she spontaneously puts God on her network. She feels a connection to God as if God were a person. And moreover, she feels that all the people in her network are also connected to God. And in fact, human religious sensibilities may have an evolutionary origin that is related to our desire for meaning and distinctly for connection. In fact, they may be grafted onto it. In fact, I think, and I talk a little bit about this in my latest book, Blueprint, I think that our religious sensibilities probably evolved subsequent to our social sensibilities. So first we develop connections to other people. Then we imagine that those connections could endure even if those people weren't in front of us. And then we imagine we can have connections either to godlike figures, okay? We can imagine we're connected to a deity, for example. So that this connection, that sense of connection we feel, especially to gods that are seen as anthropomorphic, could be kind of have evolved from or evolved upon a prior evolution of our sense of friendship. In fact, there's an inheritance of sociality the need for the company of others, and the tendency to react to perceived social isolation. And if you think about it, human virtues and social virtues, human virtues are social virtues. So for example, if you think about honesty and justice and kindness, so many human virtues, which are connected often to a sense of religion, are virtues that involve other people. So there can be independent virtues, like are you brave, for example, okay? That would be a quality you could manifest on your own, with respect to a hurricane or a predator. But most of our virtues are social virtues. We don't care whether you love yourself. We don't care whether you are kind to yourself. We don't care whether you are just to yourself. We care whether you love others, or are kind to others, or are just to others. These virtues are social. And to the extent that religions also include a kind of ethical precepts, they too are connected to all of this stuff which relates to our social interactions. In fact, sociality, this suggests that spirituality and sociality may have a shared evolutionary origin and may be related. Sociality may serve as a kind of model for spirituality, and people may form a kind of personal connection to a deity. Now, there's a survival advantage in being connected, and it turns out that there are health benefits even in having perceived connections to other people. And the deity may function as a replacement for other people when they are not available. So the idea is, if I'm with others, I'm better able to survive. Eventually we evolve to feel, oh, I should be with others, and the sense that I am with others enhances my survival. And then eventually those others could become not people, but gods. Okay? So the argument is that there could be a kind of evolution of religious sensibilities grafted onto a fitness advantage for perceiving the connection to, or the need for, connections to others. But lest we make too much of this or get too metaphysical, remember also that people can feel connection to teddy bears, or TV characters, or celebrities they've never met, or they can feel connected to each other in massively multiplayer games, well outside religious connections, or to their pets. Here's another student who drew a picture: self, father, brother, friend, tutor. Boy, she's, that's nice. And her pets: cat, dog number one, the oldest, dog number one, the middle dog, and here's the youngest dog. And she has unconditional love for these pets, okay? Or also unconditional love for her cat, which is a bit odd behavior, so unconditional love for her cat. But anyway, so she spontaneously puts cats and dogs on this social network when asked, who are the people that you feel close to in your life? So this is my point is that there's something fundamental in us that wants to feel these connections, okay? And it's that want of connection, that want to feel that connection that may connect us, for example, not only to our pets, but also to deities. And people are especially want to feel connection to inanimate or imagined objects when they are alone, such as when they are cast away or at sea. And this in turn may relate to our tendency to see faces in the most unlikely places. Now who knows what, well, I'm sure you all know what's on the left, but who knows what this is? Yeah, who's this? Wilson, yeah, right? From Tom Hanks movie, right? And I mean, he really, it's his friend, right? I mean, he talks to Wilson. He almost dies trying to save Wilson. You remember that time in the movie when Wilson is floating away and he leaps in and he realizes he's going after this ball, and he goes back to his raft. This is not, well, if you don't like spoilers, then come to the wrong class, because I don't believe in spoiler alerts or anything. I just, Anyway, that's what happens in the movie at one point. There's much more that goes on in the movie. But, so he sees this face. Initially, he puts his bloody hand, he has cut himself horribly, and he grabs his ball, and then he sees this sort of face, and he decorates it in a very, quote, primitive way. Talk about rock art. That sort of cultivates, that's been very ancient in human beings. And this in turn would be related to our tendency to see faces in the most unlikely places. There's a phenomenon known as pareidolia, which is pareidolia, which is the tendency for incorrect perception of a stimulus as an object, pattern, or meaning known to the observer, such as seeing faces in clouds or in other inanimate objects. Right? Like, you guys all saw the faces immediately when these things came up. You know, this little monk, this is in New Hampshire, this just fell down. I think it's called, what's it called, the Old Man in the Stone or something? I forgot the name of this structure. It just collapsed like a couple years ago. This is a famous mountain on Mars where people thought, who here has seen Total Recall? Oh my God, it's such a good movie. The old Schwarzenegger one is better than the newer one that was released 5 years ago. Anyway, there's a lot of idea that there were some kind of humanoid aliens that previously colonized Mars. People argued about this for a long time. This is just shadow on the cat. Nevertheless, we see it as a face, or this brutalist building here, which seems, like this. And in fact, this is such a common phenomenon that that a museum in Japan is devoted to rocks that have faces in them, with a collection of over 1,700 specimens just arrayed there of rocks with faces. And this one here, what does this one look like to you guys? Oh, come on.
National Museum.
What? You can't, there's no wrong answer to this question, so hazard a guess. What does this look like when you see that face there?
The Easter Island National Museum.
Oh yeah, like the Easter Island. Yeah, like the huge things. Yeah, I'm thinking about a movie and a cultural reference. Does this look like a sorting hat to you? Okay, when you think of Christakis, I want you to think of movie nut, especially science fiction movies. Unfortunately, like 20 years before you went. But anyway, yes, this looks like Harry Potter's sorting hat, right? As soon as I said it, you saw it. Or, for example, this one. People can even imagine what they're saying. Holy shit, we're old brick buildings. No fucking way, mate. I mean, if you look at their faces, it looks like that's what they're saying, right? I mean, you just instinctively, it sort of makes sense to you. And you see the faces, guys, oh my God, I'm a brick building. No way, they're very natural to see and project these faces in these types of inanimate objects, and even to imagine what they're saying or what they're doing. And if we can do that, you and I, looking at a building like this and think, oh my God, that makes sense, then we certainly can do it over long periods of time with natural objects in the natural world. Now, I want to discuss one result, however, that stresses the symbolic and not the material workings of religion. And I think this was taken from your readings, right? This was in the thing, yeah. This is a key result from one of the papers in your readings. This shows deaths from natural causes around the Harvest Moon Festival for elderly Chinese and Jewish women in California from 1960 to 1984. And what it shows on the y-axis is the mortality, that is to say, how likely are people to die, which is standardized here. And on the x-axis, the weeks before or after the Harvest Moon Festival. So let's see what happens to elderly Chinese women, their probability of death, as you come up to the Harvest Moon Festival. So they're in red, are the Chinese women. There's some fluctuation, some random noise from time to time, but just before the holiday, the mortality of elderly Chinese women plummets, goes way down. And then just after the holiday, it goes up, as if the women were clinging to life until they had a chance to do this festival, and then their mortality dies. Because of course, the fact that you're approaching the Harvest Moon Festival doesn't make you immortal if you're an elderly Chinese woman, right? You can't just suddenly never die. You just postpone your death, and then inevitably you do die, so the counts are postponed. Do you remember that Monica study where we showed that at the blood pressures, like if you treated the topmost blood pressures, they would go down, but those people had to go somewhere, so then they just went up in the distribution afterwards? Do you remember that slide from 2 or 3 lectures ago? Raise your hands if you remember that slide. Yeah, okay. Something similar is happening here quantitatively. The women are postponing their deaths, but they don't disappear from the sample, they just die later. And interestingly, that does not happen amongst the elderly Jewish women, for whom the Harvest Moon Festival has no symbolic meaning. So if you use as a control group the elderly Jewish women, their mortality isn't suddenly plummeting before and then going up afterwards. It's kind of staying constant around this time. Now these scientists specifically pick, so mortality amongst the Chinese here dips by 35% in the week before the Harvest Moon Festival and peaks by the same amount in the week afterwards. And this effect is seen disproportionately in elderly Chinese women for whom this is a central holiday, and not among other Chinese, nor is it seen among Jewish women, at least centered along the Harvest Moon Festival. And the largest dip-peak pattern was seen for diseases like strokes. So the women's risk of stroke goes way down just before and then goes up afterwards. Same with heart disease. So the mechanistic, the kind of illness fits with our theory about what might be happening here. So this study documents the ability of symbolic ideas to affect survival. And it also likely happens with other religious holidays in other religions. Now, there's a very important methodologic detail in this paper. Why did the scientists pick the Harvest Moon Festival? What's a reason they picked it? Do you know? What's her name?
Kelly.
Kelly, yeah?
The Harvest Moon Festival is on the lunar calendar, so it's Day.
Yes. Why is that important, Kelly?
So it's not like the changes are directly related to it being a big holiday like that.
Excellent. You want a movable feast. You want a holy day that moves around in the calendar. If you looked at Christians and you found that, let's say, Christians are less likely to die the week before Christmas and then there's a compensatory rise afterwards, maybe it's just that what happens at the end of December. Maybe there are fewer deaths at the end of December for some other reason, and then they just go up afterwards. So that's not good enough. What you want is something that changes time every year so that it's not something secular. It's not a pattern in the data that has to do with the time of year or the season. Instead, it's something to do with the actual holiday. So the scientists in this study actually picked this. They later did some other studies, which I don't cite. What's his name? Phillips, I'm sorry. Did a huge bunch of studies that look, for example, at whether there's a dip and peak around people's birth dates. Turns out there is. There's a slight decline before your birthday, as if people cling to life to live one more day. In fact, maybe I'm going to show you those studies. Or I can't see if I am. And he also looked at other kinds of phenomena. For example, your next paycheck. Do people live just a little bit longer to get that last paycheck? And then afterwards, of course, they croak. And so he's also shown that is the case. And in fact, humans respond to symbolism. And this slide shows the reference-dependent preferences for finishing times by marathon runners. And this feature is seen in marathon finishing times for data regarding 9,378,000 finishes. The dark bars highlight the density of the minute bin just prior to each 30-minute threshold. So we look at 9 million runners running marathons. How long do they run the marathon? And I'm seeing some grins because people are getting my point. I hope not only are you getting this point, but I hope your brain is moving fast to what is my underlying point that I'm making. This is the number of finishers in thousands. This is just a histogram. And look, you have these peaks every 30 minutes. It's like they run really fast. It's just they, to finish the marathon in 3 hours rather than 3 hours and 1 minute, or 3 hours and a half rather than 3 hours and 31 minutes. The symbolism matters to these people, and so they increase their performance to make that time, and of course, then they're removed from the denominator, you get a little bump down. You see how you get this little depression afterwards, and then it resumes the pattern. So there's significant bunching of performance at these round numbers. And bunching is driven by planning and adjustments of effort in the provision of effort near the finish line. So symbolism matters. People care about these things. It affects what they do, which in turn can affect what happens to them. Or consider this example of humans responding to symbolism. Using daily, this will blow your minds, at least it blew my mind. Using daily precipitation data to proxy for exogenous, like they want to do a natural experiment. So they're going to look at rainfall, and they wanted to see, did you participate in 4th of July experiences as a child? Raise your hand if you went to 4th of July, fireworks or outings or flag waving when you were a kid. Okay. My parents didn't take me to those kinds of things when I was a kid, although maybe they didn't. But many of you did. You had this experience. And you went out to celebrate this. And so what these investigators did is they looked at the role of celebrations for people born between 1920 and 1990. Large samples of people. And then they quantified days without rain on the 4th of July in the childhood of those people. And they found that it had lifelong effects. And in particular, they shift adult attitudes and behavior in favor of the Republicans and increase later life political participation. So if you happen to be a child who was more likely to have 4th of Julys which were not rainy, which meant that your parents were more likely to take you to the 4th of July celebrations as a child, this symbolic experience that you had as a child increases your probability later in life of being more conservative politically and of voting more as you're older. This is as if I could randomly assign you. They use the rainfall on 4th of July as a random assignment to a symbolic experience when you were young, having this long reach in your political commitment and ideology. One 4th of July without rain before age 18 raises the likelihood of identifying as a Republican by 2% and for voting for the Republican candidate by 4%. It also increases voter turnout by 0.9% and boosts political campaign contributions by 3%. So all of you guys have lots of 4th of July experiences. Probably like 20% of you are conservative politically, maybe between 50 and 25% of you are politically conservative. So it's not, predictive, but it plays a role. So the important symbolic childhood events can have persistent effects on political beliefs and participation. So it's not just religion that acts this way, it's all kinds of other things as well. We are meaning-making, meaning-seeking animals. And this affects our physiology, it affects our biology. Is this clear? Now I want to digress before I finish today to a quirky literature on intercessory prayer. Remember, precessory prayer is when you pray for yourself. Intercessory prayer is where you pray for others. And we know that precessory prayer helps. We just saw some evidence for that. But what about intercessory prayer? What if someone else prays for you? Can that help you? Would it matter if you knew that they were praying for you or if they were not? What do you think? Do you think it matters? If someone's praying for you, and I'm trying to guess as to whether it affects your health, do you think it matters whether you know they're praying for you or not? Raise your hands if you think it matters if you know they're praying for you. Raise your hands if you think it doesn't matter. Some variation of opinion. Some people think it doesn't matter. Some people think it matters. Well, there was a recent and large study of this phenomenon. It was a randomized controlled trial of the effects of remote intercessory prayer on ICU patient outcomes. So in this study, what they did is they took a group of people who were in intensive care units, and they found local churches, I think they were primarily Christian denominations, and they took the first name of the person, and they went to the local churches and they said, could you get your congregants to pray for this person? And the prayer, I think, was something like to have a brief hospitalization and a good outcome. And people were randomly assigned to either be prayed for or not prayed for, and the people being prayed for did not know they were being prayed for. So they did, there were 1,000 people that were admitted to the ICU, they were randomly assigned, half to be prayed for, half to get the usual care. And what they found was that this was the effects of intercessory prayer on Mid-America Heart Institute cardiac care unit scores, that's a measure of how sick they are, and length of stay in the CCU and in the hospital. And what they found was that actually the people that were prayed for had better outcomes. There was like a percent change in the score of 11%. That was barely statistically significant at the usual levels. Now the rhetorical flourish used by these authors in discussing their findings is itself fascinating. So I'm going to read to you what they said at the end of this paper. So these guys are trying to figure out, doing a randomized control trial of intercessory prayer. They get this finding, and now they have to describe it to their readers. And here's from a history of science point of view, here's a fascinating thing that they did. They said others have speculated as to what the mechanisms of intercessory prayer might be. They generally fall into two broad categories, natural or supernatural explanations. The former explanation would attribute the beneficial effects of intercessory prayer to real but currently unknown physical forces that are generated by the intercessors and received by the patients. The latter explanation would, by definition, be beyond the ken of science. However, this trial was designed to explore not a mechanism, but a phenomenon. Clearly, proof of the latter must precede exploration of the former. By analogy, this is amazing, by analogy, when James Lind, by clinical trial, determined that lemons and limes cured scurvy aboard the HMS Salisbury in 1753, He not only did not know about ascorbic acid, vitamin C, which is in the citrus fruits, he did not even understand the concept of a nutrient. There was a natural explanation for his findings that would be clarified centuries later, but his inability to articulate it did not invalidate his observations. So this is the argument that these people are making in support of it. They're saying, look, what we are doing is similar to what Lynn did. Remember, like 4 lectures or 5 lectures ago, we discussed scurvy and the effects that it can have on people. What do you guys think about this? Any thoughts on this? Either the findings or this type of argument? Well, here's another study of intercessory prayer. Now with a focus not only on whether prayer works, but on whether knowing if you are being prayed for has any effect. So this study involved randomizing people to 3 different 1,800 people randomized. They did not know whether they were getting IP intercessory prayer. They did not know that they did not get intercessory prayer, or they did know and they did get intercessory prayer. And then they were followed up over time. And this slide looks at the study of the therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer in cardiac bypass patients, a multi-center randomized trial of certain surgeons receiving intercessory prayer, published in American Heart Journal. Huge number of scientists have investigated these topics. And here's what this study found. It had 2 main findings. First, it found that intercessory prayer itself had no effects on whether complications occurred after the coronary artery surgery. And second, the patients who were certain that intercessors would pray for them had a higher rate of complications than patients who were uncertain, but nevertheless did receive the prayer. So knowing that you were being prayed for, being certain and uncertain, both these groups were prayed for, these people knew they were prayed for, these people did not know. These people had more complications than the people who didn't know, but there was no difference in the people who were prayed for and who were not prayed for when they didn't know what was happening. Now, the authors had no clear explanation for the observed excess of complications in patients who were certain that intercessors would pray for them, that is to say, group 3. Although postoperative atrial fibrillation, which is a kind of fast heartbeat, was responsible for much of the excess of complications in group 3. But this outcome is only one of the complications that contributed to the composite outcome, and it may be a chance finding. Now, it's interesting that there was no group for whom there was no prayer, but they were lied to and told they were prayed for. So you could have a 2x2 factorial design. You were or were not prayed for, you were or were not told it. They only had 3 of the cells. They didn't have the 4th cell where I tell you I'm going to pray for you and then don't pray for you. They did not have that. In fact, there are even so-called meta-analyses of these kinds of studies that combine results from numerous randomized controlled trials and that try to summarize the evidence for clinical interventions. In fact, there have been so many trials of intercessory prayer. Yes, what's your name? Helen.
Do they control for the religiosity of the patients?
Say that again?
Do they control for the religiosity of the patients themselves?
I don't know the answer to that. They probably did, but since they had large samples and they randomized, they probably didn't have to worry about that. If I have 100 people in this class and I randomly assign half of you to be prayed for to do well on the midterm and half of you not to, I don't have to control for your baseline GPA or your academic fitness. I can just, and I just want you to know that if you'd like to get people to pray for you, I'm sure you can arrange for a local church to do that, for your midterm. I used to have, I'm not very religious at all, but I used to have a particular song that I would sing when I was at Yale whenever I went to take exams, and it became a ritual for me. I would be so wound up like a spring before exams that I had to find a way of coping. And so I just had this little song in my head that I always sang. I took exams in this room 40 years ago. I remember coming here. These damn blue books, they like raise my blood pressure when I see them. So I had to train myself to cope with, and I used a variety of behavioral and symbolic means of coping with that stress. But anyway, so here's a meta-analysis that looks at all these various studies and tries to summarize and combine, is there in fact an effect of intercessory prayer? And I can't remember right now. I think that there may be a hint, maybe not. This is the composite estimate across the studies, this little tiny dot here, which is very close to 1, like the low one, favoring prayer, but the confidence intervals include 1, so you can't really be sure. Now this particular study, when it was published, prompted a very snarky and brilliant colleague of mine to do the following retroactive study of prayer. He noted that, quote, a recent systematic review of the efficacy of distance healing concluded that approximately 57%, that is to say 13 of 23, of the randomized placebo-controlled trials of distance healing showed a positive treatment effect, and therefore that prayer, intercessory prayer, has evidence that warrants further study. And so my colleague said, since we cannot assume a priori that time is linear as we perceive it, or that God is limited by a linear time as we are, we carried out our intervention 4 to 10 years after the patient's infection and hospitalization. The hypothesis was that remote, retroactive intercessory prayer reduced mortality and shortens the lengths of stay in hospital and the duration of fever. So this guy's saying, you know, this whole literature is off. I don't like this whole line of work that these scientists are doing, so I'm going to design another study that has this idea that we're going to pray for people in the past to like help them get better outcomes. You're smiling because you should be leaping ahead in your brains. Where is this going? You should know where it's going if you're paying attention. So what he did was is that he looked at the effects of retroactive remote intercessory prayer. 3,393 patients with sepsis between 1990 and 1996 that were sepsis is a blood infection that were hospitalized in a particular hospital. And in the year 2000, 4 years later, a remote retroactive prayer was said for the well-being and full recovery of the intervention group that were part of the study. And he found when he analyzed the data that 28.1% of the people who were prayed for died versus 30.2% of the people who were prayed for. So it seemed to work to retroactively pray for people who had been hospitalized in the past. And that the median length of stay was 7 days, it was shorter for the people prayed for versus 8 days, and the fever, there was maybe a little bit of an effect. And then he concludes his study, this was published in the British Medical Journal in 2001, he concludes his study by saying, this intervention is cost effective, probably has no adverse effects, and should be considered for clinical practice. Further studies may determine the most effective form of this intervention and its effect in other severe conditions, and may clarify its mechanism. What's his point? What's his point? Any ideas? Yeah, that's right. Jules.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Jules or Jewel?
Jewel.
Jewel.
So I'm confused. When did these patients die? What, year 2000?
They could have died. They didn't all die. They were hospitalized between 1990 and 1996. Some of them died. So in the treatment group, 28% of them died. So roughly about a third of these patients died. So these were people hospitalized with blood infections in that time window, and about a third of them died. 4 or 10 years later, he randomly assigns half the people to be prayed for and half not, and he finds that the half that he prayed for, who were hospitalized in the past, those half did better. What is this man's agenda? These scientists are having a conversation in the scientific literature, okay? They're being polite, but they're sticking shit into each other. You understand what's happening here? So you had a moment ago, you had the guy with Lind, right? And what's he doing? He's saying, oh, I got you guys, because I'm going to use Lind and the citrus example, and just, right? And then comes along, Libovici comes along, and he says, I got you, yes. Charles? Jalen. I'm going to get it, don't you worry. And the more you participate, the more I'll get it, which makes me happy. Jalen, yes.
I feel like basically he's using the same example that the previous one was using. He's like, the one before was saying like, we don't know yet,
yes.
We can't explain it, but it's not working.
Yes.
And he's saying the exact same thing.
Yes.
Like, in the opposite way.
Yes. It's exactly what they're doing. These guys are really pissed at each other, okay? This is what scientists are arguing, all right? And so he's doing this rhetorical argument is taking place in the literature about this, because some guys are saying intercessory prayer could be a real phenomenon, we just don't know how it works. This guy's saying, how can this be? Look at this study. And in fact, thank you, Jalen. This paper has spawned a plethora of hundreds of comments and postings if you go and look at the study after class if you're interested. For example, one person noted that one explanation was that there was indeed actually divine intervention. But in such a case, it seems to me more plausible, it's more parsimonious, To suppose that instead of deciding the length of stay and fever duration of each patient, God did something simpler for him, to decide the outcome of the coin tossing, allocating those patients with longer stays into the control group after the fact. If it is the case, this was not proper randomization, and Leibovici's study doesn't offer anything new. Right? That's actually possible. Maybe what's happening here is the deity, when Leibovici is doing the randomization, he's saying, you know what, I'm going to intervene in this puny man's pathetic efforts to weigh in on intercessory prayer, and I'm going to randomly assign the patients as the coin tosses so that it looks like he gets this outcome. And another scientist weighs in now with this debate. What I find fascinating is that this type of scientific inquiry is being used to study prayer in the first place. Because from the point of view of the history of science, I think it's very interesting that these studies of intercessory prayer have appeared in the last 20 years, particularly as we began the class in a setting in which I think industrialized democracies are struggling with their relationship to religion. Okay? Something that's been with human beings for thousands of years, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years. There's a kind of historically interesting thing that's happening since the Enlightenment, which I generally endorse, kind of decline in religious in religious hatred and violence, but we are becoming more secular. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that these studies are appearing when they are. So several aspects of religious life, belief, connection, mindfulness, behavior, appear to be good for people's health. And the mechanisms of such an effect are plausible, and the effect sizes are meaningful. Nevertheless, it's also important to note some of the very real negative consequences of religion. And there are many, also in fairness, that we have to acknowledge. It may be used to justify hatred, aggression, and prejudice. This has been a feature of human beings for thousands of years. If our religions are getting us to kill each other, we can hardly think of religion as salubrious. It may restrict scientific and medical inquiry. That can't be a good thing either, if our religion obliges us to be ignorant and not use even so-called or God-given powers of reason and observation to explore the world. It can lead us to be judgmental, alienating, and exclusive. It may restrict rather than free human agency and spirit. It may induce excessive guilt, which is not a good thing. It may encourage dangerous behaviors. So there's some religions that encourage you to cut yourself, or to put swords through your cheeks, or mortify your flesh, or roll in the dirt, or kiss an icon that 1,000 other people have kissed before you, and on and on and on, all of which may not be good for your health. It may encourage magical thinking and the suspension of reason, which often gets people in trouble. It may be used instead of medical care. I saw this all the time as a doctor. This sort of paradigmatic case of the Jehovah's Witness that doesn't want blood transfusions. This is not a problem if they're an adult. It's straightforward. They come in, you interview them, you wait, you interview them again. They're refusing treatment. They're an adult. They can die. What if it's their children? Then they cannot. You go to court, and the judge says, no, you can't do that. The child must be transfused or treated with chemotherapy. Your religion cannot be used instead of medical care. Or religion may foster failure to seek prenatal, obstetrical, or other medical care. Or it may foster failure to vaccinate your children. Quite a few vaccine avoiders in our society. I just don't think you can legitimately deny kids access to a vaccine for religious or frankly any reason except a medical reason. Not only for the sake of your kids, because your kids are entitled to such care, but also because you're not vaccinating your children imposes costs and consequences on other members of our society. It's just not okay. And it may result in topping off medication in the stopping of medication in order to demonstrate faith. So there's another phenomenon which is not so uncommon, which is people try to prove that they're God-fearing by stopping their medication. So people may, as I said, refuse blood transfusions or treatments for snake bites and so on, according to their beliefs. And this is not ethically or legally controversial for adults of sound mind, but it does become problematic when children are involved. But I think the reason that religion is so especially salient when people are truly very sick, and not just relevant to their behaviors over the life course, or whether they fall ill in the first place, is that it lies at the cathexis of vulnerability, uncertainty, loneliness, fear, and illness. When you are sick, you are vulnerable. And when you are sick, and you are lonely, it is quite understandable and natural you will turn to religion. It is very typical, in my experience caring for the seriously ill, and as we saw at the beginning, that people's minds and hearts turn to religion in these types of circumstances. Religion, in fact, fills a very special sort of void when people are seriously ill, and it cannot easily be ignored when caring for seriously ill patients. Okay, any questions? All right, so the exam will be here on Thursday. It'll be proctored. Who's in this room?
Jacob.
Jacob will be in this room. Raise your hands in the back. There you go. That's Jacob. And then some other arrangements are made for some subgroups of you in various ways. The broken arm. We've got 2 people with broken arms we're making accommodations for. Okay, see you guys then. I'll see you again a week from today.